Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Joining us today is my good friend, Dr. Jamie Metzl, a former White House National Security Council official and author of several books. When the COVID-19 pandemic started, Jamie was one of the earliest advocates for a thorough investigation into the COVID-19 origins in China, raising the possibility of a lab leak theory. But back then, it was brushed off by most scientists around the world. And more recently, from various U.S. intelligence reports, there is a growing recognition that it is not unlikely that the virus was indeed a leak accident in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Tomorrow, Jamie is going to be the lead witness at a hearing in Congress on COVID-19 origins. We're lucky to have him just before an important hearing. So welcome, Jamie.
Thanks so much, Wenqi. Happy to be here.
So the U.S. Energy Department's latest report revealed new intelligence that COVID-19 was possibly a lab leak rather than animal to human transmission. They also noted low confidence in this report. And then the U.S. government has also had other intelligence reports that had different conclusions. And then the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, also said to the media that the origin of COVID-19 remains inconclusive. So what is going on where there's so many different voices from the U.S. government?
Well, it's not that there's so many different voices. It's that we still don't know absolutely how this terrible pandemic began. And we are digging and trying to figure that out. And the primary reason that we don't know is that from day one, China and the Chinese government have done everything possible to prevent the kind of investigation that is so urgently required. They've destroyed samples, hidden records, imprisoned brave Chinese citizen journalists like Zhang Zhan. They've gagged Chinese scientists. They've impeded and prevented international investigations. And so those of us on the outside, without that access, are trying to gather as much information as possible as we can. And so what we want our intelligence agencies to be doing is digging through the available evidence. It's a very big deal that the Department of Energy has shifted its position from thinking it most likely comes from natural jump from animals to humans in the wild to a lab accident, which could be a jump from animals to humans in a lab. And when people think of the Department of Energy, I mean, some people think it's kind of like the electric company, but DOE oversees the 17 United States national labs. They're one of the largest employers of scientists in the world. The scientists who they do employ are some of the top scientists in the world in physics, chemistry, biology, biotechnology. So it's a very, very big deal. But the summary is, we don't know with 100% certainty. We need to keep investigating. And until we know, it's good and healthy to have this kind of open conversation and open debate.
So I was wondering, right, since you were the very first, pretty much one of the first, to really openly question the origins of the COVID-19, even in 2020. And based on what did you raise the question and wonder if that was a possible lab leak, even back then?
Yeah, so in the early days of January 2020, I, like everybody else, was just getting this basic information, and we started to be told it came from the market in Wuhan. It seemed reasonable based on our past experience of SARS-1. And then on January 24th, 2020, there was a paper in the British medical journal, The Lancet, which showed that over a third of the early cases had nothing to do with the market. And so that was a relatively clear early indication that the market was very, very likely where the virus spread, but not where it originated. And additional information suggesting that the outbreak may have begun maybe as early as October 2019 only make that view even stronger. So then, I mean, what I do, I mean, in my life, I'm just trying to learn things and dig and explore. And so I really just dove in and started looking at the evidence. And very quickly, there was a juxtaposition between what the data was showing me and what I was reading in the mainstream media and in the scientific media, scientific press, and elsewhere.
Where did you get the data? Since most people really it's impossible to access China, right? So where did you get the data?
So there in those early days, there were publications. I mean, this January 24th Lancet paper was a Chinese submitted paper. So there was information. And I had recently, you know this, Wenxi, not too long before the pandemic, I had, it's a whole other story for another day, but I had been invited to give a talk in Wuhan. I had negotiated, I said, the only way I'll go is if I have guarantees of free speech. And then when they realized what I was going to say, they got all nervous.
I remember that. Yeah,
and the little men in black came to my guest house and told me that they'd canceled my talk. And that's all up on my jamiemetzl.com blog. So I knew, average American was thinking, oh, Wuhan, bats, markets, this must be some backwater where a bunch of Chinese yokels are eating bats for dinner every night, and maybe sometimes they have pangolin kebabs. And I knew that Wuhan is an incredibly sophisticated, wealthy, highly educated city. I knew that it's a center of biotechnology and virology research. I knew about the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And I had been deeply involved with the Chinese CRISPR babies story, and was a member of the WHO Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. And this felt it had the possibility to be a very similar story, where there's a revolutionary technology where China has made a determination that it wants to leapfrog scientifically over the rest of the world by very aggressively doing research. And so it started to see at least a very real possibility that was what happened in Wuhan. And the more I started to dig, the more it wasn't that I proved that hypothesis, the more very real it seemed. In February, we had our meetings of the World Health Organization Committee on Human Genome Editing. And I had all of these at least suspicions or concerns. And I thought, well, I'm going to go to this meeting. My colleagues are some of the most sophisticated scientists and government regulators and others in the world. And I'm just going to tell them, well, here's what I'm seeing. And I was kind of hoping they would say, no, this is crazy. You're totally wrong. Here's what you're missing. But privately, people were saying, I have these suspicions too. And so I came back to New York. This was late February.
So these include experts and scientists in the WHO. Right?
I'm not talking about employees of the WHO, but the way it works with our expert committee is it's
outside advisors
from around the world who are brought in as part of it.
Right.
And so I came back to New York. It just seemed like a very real possibility. So I started writing. I started speaking about this very publicly and on social media. In April, I launched my website on COVID origins, which is now, if you print it out, I think it's like 100 pages long, but it started out shorter. And I just started saying, well, here's what I'm seeing. What am I missing? Here's all the evidence. Here are all the links. And it was a very lonely feeling because I just felt like I didn't know anybody else who was saying this. Everybody in the world pretty much seemed to somehow know it came from a market or from the wild. But as I tried to dig to see what evidence they were using, I couldn't really find any evidence other than it had happened this way in the past. But there have also been lab accidents in the past. And these kinds of technological capabilities in labs are relatively new. So you can't have a lab accident in the 14th century because there were no labs. So that's basically how this is. And then over the last 3 years, I've been kind of digging doggedly. And again, I was first on my own, and then a small number of us found each other and we started collaborating, and that became a group known as, quote unquote, the Paris Group.
I mean, it's fascinating for me to watch you do this, right? Because you're not a trained scientist or biologist and virologist. So why does this matter so much to you? What are you hoping to find out?
So Wenxi, we've been friends for such a long time. You know this about my history. I'm the son of a refugee. My father and grandparents came to the United States after the World War, fleeing Nazism. I've been a lifelong campaigner for human rights and for human dignity. 20 million people, according to The Economist estimates, are dead as a result of COVID-19. If we don't fearlessly examine what went wrong and learn the lessons and apply those lessons to building a safer future, the next time it could be 1 billion people dead. And I guarantee you that the people who live through that pandemic of 1 billion dead will look back at the historical record and say, did we do enough to learn the lessons this time? And I get that there are a lot of political sensitivities around this. I get that the last thing China wants to do is be open about this possibility of an accident that could have killed, led to the deaths of 20 million people. But I feel deeply committed that we have to learn these lessons. And if transparency and accountability are a foundation of a safer future, there's no possible way to build that future on a foundation of lies and half-truths now.
And I think everyone would agree, right? If accountability of the Chinese government in particular is what a lot of people are looking for. But given the nature of the Chinese government, and if we may never get to the bottom of it, as you know, said by many scientists as well. So then what? Since it has become so politicized. So that is my question. Sort of this entire process almost has derailed a lot of the, true intentions, which is good and really what we should be really focused on. But it seems to be so politicized these days. So
it is politicized. It was politicized on day one when the Chinese government began suppressing brave Chinese whistleblowers on day one.
And why do you think they did that? This is my fundamental question. Why did the Chinese do that?
Well, I mean, I think that anybody who follows anything about Chinese politics know that the last thing the Chinese government is going to do is to say, hey, we're all about transparency and accountability. We want our local officials to be fully accountable and to speak to the public about what happened. If I had to just guess, this is a pure hypothesis, but I'll say it, it's again purely speculative. My guess is the Chinese government was doing secret research probably at Wuhan Institute of Virology, maybe at the Wuhan CDC, with a well-intentioned goal, and that goal was to develop perhaps vaccines and treatments for coronaviruses, including a pan-coronavirus vaccine, which we're still trying to create. I think there was probably some kind of accident. And like with all of these accidents, you don't know that it's happened right away because these viruses replicate quickly. But if the starting number is one person and then two and then four, the numbers in the beginning are very hard to track, especially during a flu season. So my guess is it probably took a little while to figure that out. And at that point, the local officials, as is kind of always the case in China, the local officials know that if there's a problem on their watch, they're going to get in trouble. And because most of these outbreaks fizzle out on their own, my guess is very quietly they tried to do that. And then at a later point, the national government was brought in. And then they had a choice when they realized what was happening. Either they could say, this is terrible. The local government has covered things up. We need transparency and accountability, and we're just going to admit it. We're going to let the World Health Organization in. We're going to do a full investigation. We're going to share everything we know with the international community. Like if they do that, what happens? The Chinese government falls in 3 minutes because the job of local officials is not transparency and accountability in the name of the public good. It's the opposite of that. I mean, China. So
I think fundamentally you are, pointing out the biggest, I think, challenge in the Chinese political system is truly transparency or a lack of, and accountability, right? Because of how it's set up. But I think, what a lot of people especially back home in the US, a lot of people did not like is how the Trump administration sort of, politicized this issue and blamed the outbreak on China during the presidential election cycle as a way to shed its own responsibility for its own poor response to this unprecedented public health crisis too. So, I think,
if I could just jump in on that. I totally agree with that. I mean, as you know, Wenchi, I'm a progressive liberal Democrat. I was not a fan of President Trump. I questioned much of what he said. I absolutely questioned his motives. I absolutely think that these claims, which I didn't see any evidence of first, he overly praised Xi Jinping against the advice of his own government. And then when things started to go bad here, he abruptly switched course and started blaming China. I didn't like any of that. But even as a progressive Democrat, the last thing that I want to do is to suspend my critical thinking and just say, well, I'm going to condemn something because somebody I don't like said it, or I didn't like the way they said it. And so absolutely, the Trump administration politicized this topic. But it could have been, even in this terrible, crass, inappropriate, and even maybe at that time uninformed way, they were accidentally right. And so for me, that's why I always say the politics here are irrelevant. We need to understand what went wrong so we can address our greatest challenges.
Yeah, I think, as you said, the politics is irrelevant. It's interesting because Matt Pottinger, actually your co-author of a recent Wall Street Journal opinion piece on the origins of COVID-19, was just in Taiwan and actually talked about, and openly questioned of the origin issues as well. On the other side, he actually said politics, should be should trump everything in terms of how we view and evaluate the evidence. And I think the problem with being this issue so politicized, regardless of the intention, is that right now there is literally no trust or confidence. It doesn't matter whether it's China's fault or the US or the West's fault. So what we're seeing is China is further shutting down the door to any possibility to international investigation, which is kind of...
Yeah, but I would say, Wenchi, it's not further. It never had any intention to allow it. I mean, the strategy of China from the very beginning was to prevent an international investigation. That's why China slapped sanctions on Australia in early 2020 when Scott Morrison had the gall to call for an investigation. They were trying to warn every other country. So I just think, yes, there's dangerous politicization, but that has nothing whatsoever to do with China's behavior. China was never going to allow an investigation. They began their cover-up while President Trump was actually wildly and inappropriately, in my view, praising Xi Jinping. And so I do view that we shouldn't overly politicize this process, but politics is at the core of what went wrong. It is the unique pathology of the Chinese state that underpins this entire pandemic. The cover-up, the silencing of the whistleblowers, the prevention of WHO teams from going to Wuhan, the knowing lying to the WHO and the international community about human-to-human spread. That was all Chinese internal politics based on the unique pathologies of the Chinese state. Had those pathologies been different, I think it's very likely we wouldn't have the pandemic at all.
Well, what about, I want to bring it back to the US. What about the growing anti-Asian hate? That kind of, because of the anti-China hate, that was also partially fed by government policies and Trump's, of course, infamous comments about Wuhan virus and clone flu. Of course, we know, a lot of people, including you, even though you're advocating for investigation into this origin, but it's not a racist sort of behavior, but it has also been framed as a racist approach. What do you say to those people?
Well, I'm against racism and bigotry in all its forms. I've spent my entire life fighting it. Obviously, I don't think it's racist to say that this pandemic may stem from a lab accident in Wuhan, followed by a criminal cover-up by the Chinese government. And even the people who are saying it's racist, is it, as I mentioned, my knowledge of Wuhan, is it not racist to say that these highly educated, sophisticated people who don't eat bats and penguins, that they're just kind of these barbarians who are just like eating, junk from the forests, and that's why we have. It's not like that's so tolerant, and certainly the United States, we have two histories. I mean, we have a history of intolerance. We have a history of slavery, the genocide, in my view, that was committed against the Native American populations. And there certainly is discrimination against various groups, African Americans, Asians, Jews. But I would also say that the United States still today is, in my view, one of the most tolerant countries in the world. And so I wouldn't want to overplay, but certainly incidents of intolerance against pretty much all minority groups are up. And I think what I attribute that is the kind of dog whistles that certain politicians like Donald Trump have made that have legitimated certain behaviors. But these are very fringe actions that we need to fight with everything that we've got, and we need to fight them together. But I don't want to give the impression that the United States is some bastion of intolerance. I think the United States is actually one of the most tolerant countries in the world. And we have a lot of work to do to fight the bad stuff and foster the good stuff.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it also has been framed by China as a racist sort of way that the U.S. is putting the blame on China. So again, it's politicized for obviously not justified. Now, setting aside the origin of the virus, China's zero COVID policy has been one of the most restrictive, reflecting again its own governance philosophy that leans toward control over individual freedom. And on the other hand, interestingly, many thought the pursuit of individual freedom is actually a irresponsible behavior toward the greater community in combating COVID-19 spread, which is kind of the belief in most parts of Asia, including Taiwan. So what lessons have we learned from the past 3 years?
So first, what I'll say is no person and no country has a monopoly on truth, wisdom, knowledge, or anything. And so it makes me actually quite crazy when people say, well, our country did a better job or yours didn't. I mean, Taiwan actually, in my view, did a pretty great job, as did South Korea and New Zealand and others. And if we look at China in the early days of the pandemic, they actually did a pretty good job of protecting their populations. And I would never criticize a country for overly protecting its population from a deadly pathogenic disease. So I actually would praise China. The problem with China is when the lockdowns in the early days, the goal was to buy time so they could do all of the other things that needed to be done. Vaccinate the population, build out hospital capacity. And they so over-invested in that first phase in building those quarantine centers and controlling everybody that they actually didn't transition. And then as a result of just, I'll just use the stronger word, disgusting nationalism, rather than purchasing the foreign mRNA vaccines that actually worked, they refused and first inoculated their population with their far inferior Chinese vaccines. And then even that didn't do a very good job of protecting the older people. So countries like New Zealand and others who kind of had a hard lockdown first and then transitioned, I think ultimately did better. And again, the lying is the hardest part. I'm not saying this even as an American. I mean, for Chinese people, so many of them, so many people who we know have lost relatives.
Yeah.
The estimates of the number of COVID dead just in this last round are around 1 million people. And so who benefits from these lies about the Chinese fatalities? I mean, maybe the Chinese government, but it's kind of equivalent to what's happening in the war in Ukraine, where the Russian government has drafted a bunch of people from little villages. And if a few body bags come to each little village and they don't have an open media, and no one can pull the story together, for the government, you can keep your tail going. And I think it's calling for transparency and accountability isn't some kind of propaganda tool for the United States or Cold War weapon. It's a way of safeguarding all of our futures, including the people of China.
I think, interestingly, China's argument for a more restrictive zero policy actually, made sense in the beginning, but it did not make any sense that they bought all the time not to vaccinate their people properly. And when they opened up, it was almost just all of a sudden, so many more people died. It was almost like the lockdown wasn't for anything. It wasn't even worthwhile, just lost time.
I agree. And just one quick thing. And I think the United States did actually a terrible job. I mean, I'm not saying all of this to praise the United States. I think that our testing was bad. We were uncoordinated. Our messaging was chaotic. So it's not like I'm just saying, oh, America's perfect and let's criticize China. I'm happy to criticize the United States, anybody. Our question should be, what's the highest standard that we want as citizens of countries and as people living in a world? And then how do we hold everybody, including ourselves and our own governments, to those highest standards?
Yeah, I think same argument for Taiwan too, which was praised as a model country in responding to COVID. But, at the end, also the government got a lot of criticism from its own citizens. So the last question, since we have very limited time, is that, you've been a steady critic of China's undemocratic political system. And increasingly, we are seeing a world divided by camps of Western democracies, non-democracies, and non-alliance. And, I would say in the meantime, U.S.-owned domestic political messiness does not bode well for democracy promotion abroad. And Taiwan is kind of caught in between, because while Taiwan is a longtime U.S. ally and a proud, admiration for the U.S. has also been declining. And so do you still believe speaking loudly about U.S. values is the best way to show its global leadership? And more importantly, has it been effective more recently?
Yeah, so a few questions embedded in that. Certainly, as I said before, as someone who believes in human rights, I think we need to be critical of injustice wherever we see it, at home and abroad. And there is no doubt that America is becoming increasingly divided and polarized. And anybody looking at the January 6th riots and attacks in the United States wouldn't say, oh, that's democracy at work. You would say, like, geez, that's really frightening. I don't want that. And so the test of any government and governance system is, does it deliver a better quality of life? I certainly believe that having
and serve the people better. Really,
that's the standard. Better. And so I certainly believe that over time, democratic structures do better than that. That's why I'm a firm believer in democracy. But I wouldn't claim to have a monopoly on knowledge like the Meiji Japanese in the late 1860s and 1870s. We need to learn from wherever we can learn to do better. And I think America can learn from China. China can learn from America. I like to push back on what you said about Taiwan in the middle, and I don't want to be inappropriate. But the people of Taiwan are asking the American people and the American taxpayers to risk lives, resources, and to protect your democracy, which we really believe in. But if the United States said, hey, Taiwan is on its own, that's a faraway interest, it would fundamentally change your political side. I don't think it's appropriate to say that Taiwan is caught in the middle, like Taiwan is some kind of bystander. In my view, the United States and Taiwan believe in a set of principles for democracy, transparency, accountability, the rights and responsibilities of citizens. And so that's why, for me, the issue isn't American values. If this is just American values and America has something that's just American and we're trying to force that on the rest of the world, well, that's bound to fail, because what are those values? That's just imperialism. If there are a set of values, which is what I believe, that the United States and our allies and partners believe in, and these principles underpin the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we're working together to support those values, I think that's absolutely essential. So I don't think that there is a thing, American values, because if there is, those aren't worth fighting for. What are worth fighting for is human values, democratic values, the principles of the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the people of the United States, the people of Taiwan, and frankly, the actual people of China are all on the same side.
So, Jamie, among many other things, you're also the chairperson of a great initiative, One Share World, obviously is to promote those ideas. So thank you for joining us today. Good luck with the hearing tomorrow. I hope it will invite thoughtful questions to further public health governance, whether it's in China, the United States, or in the rest of the world. So take care.
Thank you so much, Wenqi. If we have time, I'd like to say one more thing. So as I told you before, as you know, I'm an Ironman triathlete, and I was visiting Taiwan a number of years ago, and I went to Hualien, and I rented a bicycle, and I biked up. I mean, it must be 10,000 miles up this hill, and I've never received more jiayos than every single car that passed me. Somebody yelled "Jiao" out the window. So I hope that if people are watching my testimony tomorrow morning, and you can watch it live stream, that you will be giving me Jiaos as I try to fight for transparency and accountability and a better future for everyone.
Well, thank you for sure. All right. Well, thank you. That was great.
Good.